I am LaChaun Banks, and I have a presentation that I'm going to go ahead and share with you all. And I'll talk throughout the whole presentation, but I do want to share my slides just because I'm a visual person, and so I have things laid out visually. Excellent. Okay, great. So I'm LaChaun Banks, and I am going to do this presentation and talk a little bit about who I am, not too much in the beginning because I'm going to talk about it throughout the presentation. I'm going to talk about the goals for this course, why this course is important, why I feel it's important. I'm going to talk a little bit about the skills competency that you would gain if you took this course, and then have a final word, which I always like to end with. So one of the things that I'm very interested in is this representative pedagogy, teaching from experience. And this course is about economic development and racial equity, and being both on both sides of that. I feel that it just enriches the course itself. So currently, I am a part of the Ash Center for Democratic Governance at Harvard Kennedy School. I'm also with the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative with Harvard Kennedy School. But my full-time day job, I am a full professor at UNC Keenan Flagler Business School here in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So I live in Durham, North Carolina, and I commute and come back to Harvard Kennedy School probably about once a month. I'm actually going to be there next week for most of the week, but this will come up later into how this course evolved. And sorry about some of the bottom pieces, because I do guest lecture for Harvard Kennedy School quite often, so sometimes I use the same slide, but it's critical for me to state this from the beginning of the goals for this course. And I've adopted this over the last year or so because the course does get into some really hot button topics. And so I always like to lay the foundation of what this course is not and what this course is. And you'll hear a little bit of the flavor of this during the presentation today. So what this course is not. This course is not about blame. And I have to say that because I will present historical facts and policies, programs, and initiatives that have harmed certain community, especially communities of color. But the course is not about a blame for one group doing one thing. This course also isn't mind changing. I am not here to change people's minds. What I am here to do is encourage critical thinking based on data and evidence that may or may not be new. In my MBA class that I teach here at UNC, we had a discussion about reparations. And I asked if people were for or against it and to give me a reason. And so the goal isn't for me to get everyone on board with reparations, but the goal is for me to say, if you are against it or if you're for it, I need you to critically think about how you're going to explain your argument and how are you going to measure success. And then lastly, this comes up quite a bit, this issue of deservingness. And you'll see this in the presentation today. And I want this to come out of folks' minds of deservingness, because I'm really talking about these axiomatic notions of fairness and opportunities and choices. But I'm not talking about who deserves what, because that is starting to get into this blaming again. But it comes up, it always creeps up. So I like to put these out in the forefront. So, theory of change. My theory of change, I have adopted from the Bloomberg Center for Cities, just because that's where I've worked the most. And I really do believe that it is values driven, data informed, outcome oriented solutions to wicked problems. And wicked problems are multi-sectoral. They are not black and white. They are complex. But I believe we're currently living in a world of wicked problems right now, and especially in this country. So why this course, right? Why is this course relevant now? Why take this course? Why do I feel that it's important? Well, I want to start off with a story. And I like to illustrate a lot of this through stories. So the year was 1953, and there was a 13-year-old boy by the name of Tommy Cummings who drowned in Baltimore's Patapsco River while he was swimming with his friends, two other white boys and one black child. They were forced to play in these dangerous waters because at the time pools were segregated. So he was one of three Black children that died that summer. So the NAACP actually sued the city of Baltimore, saying that we're paying tax dollars for public amenity and we're segregated from being able to go to those public amenities. So 3 years later, on appeal, June 23rd, 1956, the NAACP won. And for the first time, children of different races had the chance to swim together. But what happened is desegregation started to call into question, what is a public good? So towns across America, not just in the Jim Crow South or the southern part of the United States, but in all towns, instead of integrating their pools, they decided to close them. Warren, Ohio dealt with this integration problem by creating a members-only veteran swim club. Montgomery, West Virginia, they dealt with their issue by letting a brand new pool that was built 4 years ago sit to be able to do a private parks association where only whites were allowed. Montgomery, Alabama, they had one of the best departments in the world, and effective January 1, 1959, the city closed the parks, drained the pool, and they sold all the animals in the zoo in defiance for 10 years. And lastly, one of maybe the worst is in St. Louis, Missouri. A white mob attacked every Black person in sight that came to the city to be able to swim to these pools. And so the city itself had to return to segregation, citing public safety. Black citizens sued again, but in Palmer versus Thompson, the Supreme Court held that a city could choose not to provide a public facility rather than maintain an integrated one, because robbing the entire public, the white leaders were spreading equal harm. So now it gets to, what is really a public good? So we know public goods are distributive policy, which means everyone pays in and everyone gets out. But what's the technical definition for a public good? So I asked the class this, and I always get this technical answer from Harvard Kennedy School. It is a non-exclusive, non-rival good, once made available, blah, 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 right? But I think about, if we think about what we hear in the news, what our family members or other generations think about public goods. And I think about my parents and my grandparents and people who've grown up in different places. When we hear public goods, we just think public schools, libraries, parks, and community centers. Like, this is where our tax dollars are going. So let's look at this. Back in 1857, a man by the name of Hinton Rowan Helper wrote a book called The Impending Crisis of the South and How to Meet It. What Helper did was he examined in 1957 how many public amenities were in the northern states, which were more free, than the southern states, which slavery was still legal. And what he found was quite interesting. So in Pennsylvania, public libraries, they had 393, but in South Carolina, they only had 26. For public libraries in Maine, they had 236, but in Georgia, they only had 38. And in 1857, for public schools, New Hampshire had over 2,300, while Mississippi only had 782. So Hinton himself, he was an avowed racist. He would tell everyone that he hated Black people, but he was actually against slavery because he saw what it was doing to people in the South who were poor white people. So he made this understanding calculation, I would say, that in the North, the governing class will tax themselves to invest in amenities that serve the public because they need to. And why? They need to make it livable for themselves, but also attract and retain people on whom their profits, workers, and customers depended on. This is economic development, you all. This is what the basis of economic development is. But during that time in the South, neither was necessary. Number one, the South relied completely on a captive and unpaid labor force. There were only a small number of white workers that needed to work on a farm anyway, because most of it was staffed by slaves. And they did not need to invest in education for people, be it Black or white, because the plantation owners and the people who had wealth could pay for education for their children and their family members. So they really didn't need to invest in that. And they did not depend on local customers, individuals, or businesses. Can somebody tell me why? And you can just say it out loud. Why did the South not need to depend on local customers? And take a guess here.
I said cotton.
Say it again.
Cotton.
Exactly. That is exactly right. Cotton. The market for cotton was a global exchange, and factories that bought the raw goods, the cotton, were in the north and they were staffed by wage laborers. Okay, so what now? Why are we talking about what happened in 1857? Because the South had done so little to support education, innovation, and small businesses, slavery was actually making Southern whites poor. And if we look at today, 9 out of the 10 states in the United States that are poor are in the South. And 9 out of the 10 states that are the least educated are also in the South. There's an economist at Harvard by the name of Nathan Nunn that published an article that said any county that relied on slave labor in 1860 had lower per capita incomes in 2000. So any county, and that means that slavery initially had this impact of making the people around that county poor. So, okay, let's fast forward to today. One thing that I hear a lot of times is, LaChaun, desegregation happened. You have affirmative action. You have the same opportunity to succeed as any white person in America right now. And when I created this slide, we did have affirmative action, which, as you know, now is gone at UNC and Harvard. So let's talk a little bit about the timeline of what happened in the United States. So we're going to call this making all things equal. In 1948, President Truman signed the executive order integrating the armed forces following World War II. When I send you this slide deck, you can actually click on the picture, and it is actually a newspaper article from that day. So, okay, things are happening, right? 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. You all may have heard of this. The Supreme Court ruled it unlawful to segregate public schools by race. So in 1954, it was only public schools by race, not public amenities. So did that work out for us? And I'm going to say us because I consider myself a Black woman. No, it didn't work out. Why? Because in the 60s, Southern states found ways to keep Black and white students separate while still complying with Brown versus Board of Education. Some districts used what's called pupil placement boards, which claimed to place students in the best interest of the child. So it didn't work out for us. So in 1960, like I said, Southern states found ways to keep Blacks and white students separate. In 1964, we have this landmark Civil Rights Act you may have heard of. It outlaws discrimination based on race, religion, color, sex, national origin for voter registration requirements, racial segregations in pools, and public accommodations. This is the first time we're hearing about public amenities and employment discrimination. Did this work out for us? No, it didn't work out again because Southern states were still not complying. They kept schools segregated. The NAACP challenged this placement and they wanted to adopt freedom of choice plans, saying that no child of the opposite race would actually opt to go to another school, and transportation hampered their choices greatly. So in 1968, the court responded to the defiance of Southern states in the ruling of Green versus New Kent County that ineffective freedom of choice plans would not be tolerated if schools remained segregated. Then we go to 1968. This is the Civil Rights Act of 1968, Fair Housing Title Acts 8 and 9. And this is where we saw that there could not be discrimination in house rental and mortgages and all that kind of stuff. And what happened during this time with the Fair Housing Authority? We saw redlining, right? So that didn't really work out. So in 1969, the Supreme Court said it has been over a decade. We are not playing any more games. Everyone needs to desegregate all at once. So the Southern states said, yeah, we'll desegregate, no problem. We're desegregated. But if Blacks want to come to our school, we're not going to pick them up with buses. So they're going to have to get here on their own. So, down in my home state of North Carolina, 1971, Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg, the Supreme Court unanimously approved the use of busing as a means to achieve desegregation. So now all is right with the world. And we know that that's not the case. What happened during this time? Now we start to see white flight. Families moving out of the city, white families moving out of the cities and adopting for private schools or all white suburban school districts. And if you think about where people live versus where they work, what happens if you have an exodus of people leaving from the inner cities that are building their own little mini cities in the suburbs, right? They're creating their own schools, they're creating their own shops and markets. And so you still don't have this sharing of an economy because now things are so dispersed. So I want to talk a little bit about choices. Can someone tell me what the bootstrap narrative is here in America? What do you know of the bootstrap narrative? What does it mean to pick yourself up by your bootstraps? Yes, Nathan.
The idea that rugged self-reliance, rugged individualism, you're, you're trying, you're going to pull yourself up into prosperity and do it pretty much in a solitary manner, ma'am.
Okay, thank you so much. I like that definition. So we have heard pull yourself up with your bootstraps. It's this notion, the belief that a person in the United States that works hard, assumes personal responsibility, and maintains a strong moral center can accomplish anything. So the other way of saying this is if you are poor, if you are doing poorly in life, you're doing poorly because of the choices that you made, not because of any restriction that was put on you. That you've made poor choices. And so that's why you're not doing as well as someone who has made better choices. But from even the brief history that I just showed, is that really the case? The choice between am I able to go to college or do I need to continue working to provide for my family? Am I able to stay at home with my newborn or do I have to go back to work if I'm a woman? Or am I able to buy a house or will I always rent? These, what seem to be individual choices, some of these have been set at the policy level. And that's what I want to get to with this course is that things that we think are individual choices may not always be the case. So we're going to insert here this City Leader Guide on Equitable Economic Development, which is my little mini claim to fame. So working with Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative, about 5 years ago, I worked with a team of folks and created this guide on equitable economic development. And so for over 5 years, I've been deploying this guide with mayors across the country and a few international to help create more equitable policies in their city. And so why was this created? So this wealth gap that I'll talk about briefly, it was created with the country. And for a long time, the government has been a driver of this wealth gap. So in the 20th century, the government took steps to close this gap, such as the things I just said, desegregation, affirmative action, and other public policies. But this need for changing economic development really came into play when COVID hit. And so what this guide is, it is our attempt at Bloomberg to rebuild local economies from the beginning with having an equity lens. I hear so many times that mayors and city leaders and other organizations, equity is a buzzword and DEI can be great when times are going well. And then something's going to happen. And then all of a sudden it is, we can't focus on equity. We have other crises. And my premise is that if you had equity built into the systems, then you wouldn't have to focus on equity because it will already be there and your crises would look different. So let me talk briefly about the skills that you would gain from this course through the whole semester. The first one is people analytics and stakeholder engagement. I love the cases that we do in class. We're going to do everything from the Chilean mining rescue case to a case that I wrote for Bloomberg in Jackson, Mississippi, dealing with Mayor Chokwe Lumumba and infrastructure crisis. And you're also going to get frameworks that were created by myself and other faculty members. Leadership that drives organizational success, there will be a lot of real cases that aren't necessarily case studies, but coming from experience, looking at what things have worked and what hasn't. Data-driven decision making, that's what this course is about. Also, building high-performing teams. And then understanding and improving social impact. And the last thing I want to say is economic development. I hear people talk about economic development all the time. It has so many different meanings. It depends on what region you're in. It depends if you're urban or if you are rural. It depends on so many things. And so we're really going to break down what is the true definition of economic development and how can we have an impact on it. So some of the guest lectures that happen in the class, every year I have someone from the Department of Energy. He is no longer with the Department of Energy as of this administration, but he still comes back to guest lecture and talks about DOE and the things that they've done. We have a professor from Duke University who wrote the book on reparations, Dr. Sandy Darity. He does come to guest lecture at every class or every time I hold this course. The Harvard Growth Lab comes. We have practitioners and Harvard Kennedy School faculty that comes to guest lecture. So let's talk a little bit about shared understanding of terms, because I told you how people have a different understanding of what economic development is. Well, that is in not just that word, but in so many things. And so part of this course is saying, if you really want to have an impact on X, how are you defining what X is? How are you defining the measures of success? How will you know if it'll be successful? How do you know how you can make it successful? And so I always like to start with this shared understanding of terms. And one example I'll give is these two pictures right here. These are stock images, but I'll tell you what I pulled them for. So it was December in 2020, and I was working with the mayor who was in Ohio, and I'm not going to state the town. It wasn't the biggest town. But he said he had a real big problem with his constituents. The older constituents were saying, keep in mind, this is December 2020. They said, post-COVID, we really need to rebuild. But his younger population of folks were saying, no, we need to recover. So younger folks were saying, we have to recover from this. Older folks were saying we have to rebuild from this. They were talking about the exact same things, but they were using different languages. So every time, or different words, every time he would go and say something at a town hall, he was alienating a group of his constituents. So he said, listen, I just need a clearer talk track, because what I'm doing is actually what both groups are asking for, but we're just not using the same terminology. So with that, I'd like to also talk about what do I mean by racial equity. And this definition I have taken from Toni Griffin, who is at Harvard Kennedy School. She's the founder of Urban AC. She's the director of the Just City Lab. And this I really appreciate. So equity is, and this is just from the Oxford Dictionary, the quality of being fair and impartial. But so what is racial equity? It can mean different things to different people. But we can say that racial equity is realized when race can no longer be used to predict life outcomes, and outcomes for all groups are improved. So this is saying that we're not going to be able to look at race and tell how long someone will be able to live, but also everyone's life is improved. And that's something that I believe heavily in. So I want to also talk about racial justice, because the way that Toni Griffin described this in so visual, I have started to adopt this in how I speak about it. So American exceptionalism, if we look at when the country was built, this is how it was. White people were on the podium and Black people were slaves. They brought Black people over as slaves. Okay, so then people talk about equality. Let's talk about equality. This is putting a Black person on the same level as the white person. Equality, making them equal. But what do you notice here? The actual size of the Black person is still less than the size of the white person. And that is because it's taking longer to catch up, right? We're starting from less. Even though you want to make things equal, we're starting from less. And so we're not catching up as fast. So then we have equity, right? That's this difference between equality and equity. And so equity is saying, okay, let's give people who need it a little bit more of an advantage. And this will put them at the same height or it have the same resources as their white counterparts. But then if we think about true American liberation, it would be everyone, all races being equal without having footing, same size, same height. I'm keeping an eye on time because I'm going to leave time for questions. So let's think, is it really that bad in America right now? We hear a lot of anecdotes about how things are. This is a chart that I pulled from Opportunity Insights with Professor Raj Chetty. And this is showing the likelihood of a young Black child that's a male to grow up and earn more money than their parents who were at the bottom of the income distribution. So this is the American story, right? We want our children to do better than us. This, you can think of it as maybe rags to riches, right? Can someone who grew up in a poor family grow up to not be poor? And so if you look at this and you see the scaling for white males versus the scaling for Black men, and then at the bottom, you can see this annual salary. It looks like these are two different maps with different scalings, but it's not. And so this is what we mean when we say sometimes they're two different Americas, depending on if you're white or if you're Black. One thing I want to talk about here is that this is not new. There have been a lot of folks who have done research in social sciences trying to understand why racial disparities are such an enduring feature in America. And there have been many theories put forward. I just want to show you all some, but the two things they're trying to assess is what matters and how can one make progress. So here are a few different groups that I wanted to talk about. So there has been work done on family level factors, right? Things that vary across households. Differences in parental income could be something that can explain why there are differences in race when people get older. Black kids are growing up in lower income families more than white kids on average. Maybe that's explaining it. Or family structure, single family versus multifamily, levels of education. So that's one group of research that's been done. The next group is around these structural features in the environment, things that are external to the family, like segregation in neighborhoods or the qualities of schools. How much is this actually determining what's happening when people become adults, this upward mobility? And then lastly, we have these cultural factors and social norms, things like people's aspiration may differ depending on where they grow up or which communities they grow in. And even looking at this notion of being in the in group or the out group. Remember when you were in high school, there were the cool kids and not the cool kids. How much does that explain why there are disparities when people grow up to earn income? So Saunders Theater at Harvard University, if you haven't been up there, and if you're going up in May, I would advise or highly suggest that you stop by. It is a beautiful, beautiful theater, and they host classes in there. Well, half a century ago, Dr. Martin Luther King came to speak about civil rights at Harvard University, and he was there. These are actually the steps, and he presented in Saunders Theater back in 1965. I had the fortunate luck to be able to take a class there in Saunders Theater with Raj Chetty. He's the one that created Opportunity Insights and stand on that very stage that Dr. Martin Luther King stood on to talk about civil rights. And so I always like to give this a frame of reference. And so if we look at median household income in the United States by race and ethnicity between 1967 and 2000, I just want to show you all, if you look at this, race is separated by different colors. So Asian American or Asian is green. We have Black as the gray line. American Indian and Alaska Native is the orange line. But look at where these median household incomes are. And if you look back to the time where Dr. Martin Luther King came to speak around that time to where we are in 2022, there has been progress. This line is upward sloping. But if you can see the median household income of Blacks in 2022 is still less than what the median income household was for whites back when civil rights era was happening. And another way to look at this is median income among working class and professional class households. And here I just wanted to highlight two numbers. And this is from 2010, 13, 2016, and 2019. And this is work published by Dr. Sandy Darity and Dr. Addo into 2024 at Duke and UNC respectively. In 2019, the working class median income of whites compared to the professional class of blacks is still more. So that means, as I was told as a little girl, as other people I know, if you go to school and you get that law degree and you become a doctor, you're going to do well here. But what this is saying is that even with those degrees, if I'm a Black person, statistics are showing that I will, on average, earn less than my white counterpart who doesn't even have the same education as me. And so this is why I want to have this class to talk about these structural barriers, which again, remember, people say is choices. Hey, you didn't make a good choice to go to school. Actually, I did. I went and got my MBA, but I'm still earning a little bit less than other folks. So where is that challenge? And so the last things I'll say is the moment that you think that we are worlds apart. I have a picture here of Thomas Edison, Harriet Tubman, and Ronald Reagan. Does anyone know what these three people have in common? Can you tell me? Very different people. What do they have in common? Okay, I'll tell you all. They all were alive at the same time, which to me is really startling that Harriet Tubman was alive when Ronald Reagan was alive. Now she was on her way out. He had just came into the world, but all these people were alive at the same time. And so the moment I hear, oh, slavery happened and, we have these policies in place, I mean, we're not that far removed. And then my final word for this, and I'll open it up to questions, is that if you take everything I said today and you take out race, you take out gender, you take out socioeconomic status, you take out all these things that make us feel uncomfortable, the truth of the matter is that this is a fight right now between the have and the have-nots. No matter what you want to think about race or gender, it's between the have and the have-nots. And what we're seeing is that the haves are shrinking and the have-nots are growing. So think about the implications on infrastructure, on policy, on governance, on rural areas. Think about the implications if you have a growing group of folks who are the have-nots. So with that, I want to say thank you for letting me present and listening to me today, and I will open it up for any questions. Okay, let's see.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I am just kind of like, I've heard some of these statistics before, but it's still shocking every time. And I'm wondering if does your course kind of help students understand how to solve the problem, or is it more just to think about it and then kind of go off and come up with solutions?
It is if you take this course, you will be with a group of students. I will pair you or put you with a group, and you will come up with a growth strategy for a city. So you will do the work to come up with the strategy. And we are going to talk about, again, these frameworks of how you can be successful, how you can look at peer city benchmarking to say, okay, well, here I want to focus on manufacturing. I think that the manufacturing sector isn't working. How can I look at other cities? How can I use this economic indicator of health to understand, will I have the biggest bang for my buck? So yes, we will go into, and we'll go into what has been done and what's worked in other cities too.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Kristen.
Thank you. I was just wondering that if perhaps you have had to tailor this message to certain audiences. This is something that I'm having to deal with some similar topics, and I'm wondering if you have to customize them all at all based on your audience because of the current climate that we are facing. And if so, if there are tools that you find are useful to make it more accessible to these audiences.
I haven't changed anything. And it's interesting because, yeah, we're in different times, but, I was doing this working with this in 2020 post George Floyd. And that was a critical time, right? In the Black Lives Matter movement. And then we had it going the opposite way. And even when the Supreme Court decision came out about affirmative action, I didn't change a thing. I encourage folks to have these critical conversations and I hold space for it. So I have not changed anything as of yet. And it's interesting because my class continues to get renewed. Now, it is in jeopardy every year, but even at a business school, they have said, we want you to keep teaching this because this is something that we need to hold space for. So yeah, I haven't had to change it as of yet. And I don't think I could, to be honest, because that's why I put that disclaimer up front is that, I'm not trying to make any moral judgments about anything, but I will present facts of things that have happened so that we can look at going forward if we really do want to create a growth strategy that's inclusive of the population. What things do we need to watch out for?
Absolutely. No, that's very admirable. Thank you so much.
I get beat up too. Don't worry about it. Not physically, but yeah, we get into discussions, but it is all in the name of learning. And it's interesting because people say, what do you think we need right now the most to deal with democracy or to deal with this? And one of the things I think is education. And so that's why it really upsets me to think about critical race theory and that whole area, because, I don't even think critical race theory is a word that should be talked about. But I think it's important for this to continue on, that we do need to understand historic context without putting judgment on it. That's the harder thing to do, is not having that judgment. And when students start to speak, they can feel that judgment coming in because that's our natural, right? We judge things. That's what makes us human. We have to judge situations to know if they're dangerous or not, but it goes into how we think. And so really being able to disentangle what is logic versus what is emotion and feeling, that's where the challenge comes in, but we work through it together, I promise.
Absolutely. No, those are some great points. Thank you so much.
Oh yeah. Lindsay.
Sorry, I have another one.
That's okay.
What are some strategies that you have seen that have been successful, and like how do they come up with an idea and then implement it, and then how do you measure, like how do you focus on, like, trying to figure out how to word it like that. I'm just impressed that this is you can plan a city around things and make change happen this way. Now I wish I had known about the class and had made room for it to fit into one of my degrees here. How do you figure out what you want to focus on and then figure out what's going to work and then implement it and then measure that it's work? Like could you give an example of something that's been successful and how, what the process looked like?
So we'll talk about cross-sector collaboration and P3s and community benefit agreements, and some cities have really leveraged those a lot. So part of that city leader guide that I showed you, it came about because mayors were saying, I don't know where to start. I know that a city that's like me says that they built an incubator and so they got more entrepreneurs and they're doing well, but is that for me? So we actually go through the process of looking at the economic landscape to see where those gaps. We need to understand what is the challenge in this city, because every city's different and every city has history. We also do this organizational readiness, and that's what I meant by leveraging high performing teams and leadership. So there may be times where a city says, okay, I understand my gap is this neighborhood right here is really struggling. I can see what industries they need, but even on top of that, we're not ready to tackle the issue here in City Hall because we don't have a shared understanding of what the problem is. We don't put our money where our mouth is. So we even have this pre-assessment to say, am I ready to even take on this challenge of creating more equity in my area? So that's a whole diagnostic tool itself. Then after that, we say, well, what is the challenge? Is it around a shared economy, meaning that economic activity and ownership is shared across all the demographics, regardless of race, regardless of age, regardless of immigration status, regardless of disability? Does my city do a good job with economic activity shared across everyone? So maybe it does. So then the next one is, what about my skilled economy? Are people here getting jobs that live here? Or are we attracting people that live outside of the city? So you go through these 5 different ways of assessing the economic landscape to understand, is it industry that's a problem? Is it lack of skill? Is it, systemic issues? What is the real problem we're trying to solve for? So that's what the class takes you through, that iterative process of looking at a city and saying, where's the real problem? They may have a high poverty rate, but why? Is it because people can't work, or is it because they're not at good schools? Like, where is that challenge? And so we go through that together. So it's funny because people ask me all the time, what should we do? Give me one thing that we should do. And what I tell mayors all the time is, it wasn't one thing that got us here. So it's going to look different depending on where you are. How reliant are you on your major industries? I mean, think about New York City. In the 50s, their major industry was the garment industry. And then when the garment industry didn't work, they were able to succeed because other industries jumped in, like the financial industries. But look at Dearborn, Michigan. Ford, when Ford started, he bought up a ton of farmland. And so even in 2025, the city is saying we have restrictive deeds on land that we can't even build businesses on. And that's because manufacturing in the cars went away and there wasn't another major industry that could step in. So in the mix of all of this historical racial context, we are talking about real issues of economics and economic development, and how can you create things that's going to be inclusive of folks.
Thank you. Is there one that you're aware of that the city implemented where you saw how it worked and what the outcome was? Or
Well, I'll tell you where you are, Minneapolis, Lindsay.
Yeah.
One of the things I love that you all did was the Stable Homes, Stable Schools project. And that was back in 2017 or 18. And I used that as one of the case studies. And that was a relationship between the school district and some folks at City Hall, where you all tried to understand if students were on the brink of homelessness. And so teachers would look at that, like, are kids wearing the same clothes? Are they coming in disheveled? And then they would actually step in and provide support for rental assistance and other things like that. But because it was put under education and not anti-poverty, it actually got more funding and did a little better. So that was one of the successes. There was another one with, Mayor Jacob Fry has done a lot around zoning, right? And so we look at zoning and these zoning laws. How have they been effective? And I remember in 2019, he had just turned single family zoning to multifamily zoning, and it didn't take off as fast as the city wanted. But if you fast forward to 2024, it actually is doing pretty well, because Minneapolis has had the least amount of rent increases than your neighboring cities like St. Paul and other areas. So it was slow to take off, but if we look at measuring this, now it's doing better. San Diego had a homelessness issue like any city in the country, but one of the things they did is they said, we need to understand, what is our homeless population? People are homeless for different reasons. And are we trying to alleviate homelessness, or are we trying to remove homeless people from the streets? Because those are two different things. I didn't realize they were two different things. They are two different things. If you want to alleviate homelessness and you put all your resources into that, do you know what happens? You get coined as a town where it's great to be homeless. So now you have other people coming that are homeless. So you're actually increasing your homeless population. So if your job is to alleviate poverty and homelessness, the first thing you're going to see is an influx of homeless people. But why do people want to alleviate homelessness? I hear all the time business saying, you know what, they can be homeless, just don't be homeless on my storefront. So then you have this not in my backyard. So then they tell the city, do something with these people. Like you can alleviate it, but get them from downtown, right? So now you say as a city, is my actual objective to move them than to find out why they're homeless? And so how can we start to measure these things? And so San Diego, I use that as an example because they have this framework of how do they take in people who are homeless and triage them. Do they need shelter for just a couple of nights? Or is it something where they really do want a home and long-term rental assistance? Is it something where we can just help with this? So they figured out a way to triage people who are homeless at these different areas that they show up.
Oh, thank you. And thank you everybody for joining us too.